Hey there, my name is Alexis and I'm going to show you how I built this desk using only half lap joinery. So the base of the desk will be entirely made up of 1x2 red oak board, and I start off by cutting one end at a 6.6 degree angle. Then I just measure the length of the leg that I want the leg to be so I can repeat the same cut on that same piece, making sure I cut it on the right side of that leg. And what helped me maintain a consistent length throughout the next 3 leg pieces is I clamped that first piece over the next piece I'm going to cut. I score a line, line up my miter saw blade with that line, and that allowed me to get 4 equal length pieces. And I repeat the same process for the stretchers, although the orientation for the angles will be a little bit different. And if you happen to be interested in building something like this for yourself, I'll leave an email in the description if you want a copy of the cut list for the exact dimensions for this build. Now that the legs and the stretchers for the legs are cut, now I can mark out the locations for where I want the stretchers to be connected to the legs using half laps. So from what I've seen online, most people make half laps using a table saw with a crosscut sled, or a circular saw, or a miter saw with a depth stop. I'm gonna try making them with a router. And in order to minimize the stress that's gonna be put on the actual router bit, I decided to remove some material using a Forstner bit, and I just marked out the depth I want that Forstner bit to go so that I just don't make too deep of a cut. And it's been a while since I've used the router in this way, so I thought it would be fine to just remove all the material I needed to remove all at once, when in fact I should have done this in multiple passes, and as a result I ended up getting a small amount of blowout from the router bit, and it took out a big chunk of material that now I need to repair. And it was a simple fix, although I wish I just could have avoided that entirely, but that's how we learn. So I just used a chisel to remove the material so that I have a flat surface, and then I cut off a piece of oak that sort of matches that grain pattern, and I just glued it on there and left it for a couple hours. Then once the glue had cured, I used a flush cut trim saw to remove the excess material. Then I use my palm sander using 120 grit sandpaper to remove any remaining material. So for the next half lap, I used some scrap plywood I had lying around as sacrificial pieces so the blowout doesn't happen on the main piece I want. And I just made sure they were properly clamped so that they don't shift on me while I'm using the router. And it worked really well. I just had to make sure the top of the plywood piece was flush with the top of the hardwood, because 3/4 inch plywood isn't exactly 3/4 of an inch, while the hardwood is exactly 3/4 of an inch. A little bit of a tight fit. Perfect. It's a little tight, but I think that's good if it's tight, honestly. So there were a couple half laps that I made that were a little too wide, so to fix that loose joint, I took off a little bit more material so that I had at least a 1/16 of an inch gap, and then I used my miter saw to cut a 1/16 of an inch shim to fill in that gap. And from then on, it's just rinse and repeat, marking out your outlines for where you want your half laps to be. And the most important thing I got from this is just making sure you accurately measure where you need your router to be when you're making your half laps. Because a couple of times when I've eyeballed it, I ended up having a slightly loose opening, which then I would have to take off more material so that I could fit a shim in there. So take your time on accurately measuring where you need your router to be. And I don't know if this applies to everyone, but my router is kind of on the more lower end, budget friendly router, and you can actually lock it in a way where it's not perfectly straight down. You can actually have that router lock in at an angle, and as a result you could potentially have a slightly wider opening while still measuring it correctly. So try to get comfortable understanding how your router works in terms of aligning it right and having it at the right depth before you go about cutting into your main workpiece. So once you've done your half flaps for your legs, next is to make the half flap openings for your aprons for your desk. So it's essentially the same process as you did before, but the main important difference here is each half flap consists of 2 separate wood pieces this time, while before you were only making a half flap in individual wood pieces. So instead of making 8 individual half flap openings, I clamped everything together and cut the half flaps for both sets of legs. So instead of making these half flaps in 8 sessions, I essentially made these half flaps all in 2 sessions. And I think this is the best way to make the half flaps for this part of the build in order to minimize the potential error you may have between the 2 separate pieces when you're making them half flaps separately. And the amount of time you save cutting these half flaps this way is reduced by about 75%. And if you were to go this route, just a thing to keep in mind is making sure each leg assembly is properly clamped, making sure the outlines you've made are properly aligned before you do this. And I forgot to mention, I haven't glued anything yet. Everything is just friction fit at the moment. And once you have your leg assemblies clamped together, you just gotta make sure they're properly clamped to the workbench, which was a thing I had to figure out because of the limited space due to the legs being in the way of the workbench. So I had to spend like a couple minutes just making sure it's properly secure. And as for the bottom stretchers for the legs, I could just cut them normally without the legs being attached since they're just one single piece. And like I did for the top stretchers of the leg assembly, I did the half flaps for both bottom stretchers at the same time as well. Then once the half flaps for the leg assemblies were done, I can finally outline the locations for the half flaps for the bottom bracing as well as the front and back apron of the desk. So once the half flaps for those remaining pieces were done, I could finally start working on the glue up. And for some of the connections, they were a little too tight to a point where I needed to use some clamps, so I just made sure I took my time for that. I don't want to accidentally put pressure in the wrong area and potentially damage the stretcher or the legs. And as for the glue up, I did multiple thin coats of glue just to make sure I had even coverage throughout and that there was proper bonding between the 2 different pieces. And before I did the glue up for the top stretchers, I decided to remove some material from the bottoms of the stretchers to give it a more angular look so it complements the legs more. And to do this, I clamped my belt sander with 80 grit sandpaper to my work table, and I slowly put pressure against the workpiece, against the belt sander, and it took off the material really easily and really quickly. Then I could finally finish up gluing up the legs, and then I could proceed with the glue up for the desktop, which consisted of 2 layers of 7¼ inch red oak and 1 layer of 1½ inch red oak to give me a total depth of 16 inches. So first I cut the 7¼ inch red oak to rough length, and then I added a few liberal coats of wood glue to every edge surface that's going to be in contact with each other. Since I'm not going to be using any dowels or pocket screws this time, I'm just going to rely just on the glue, and it should be enough. And then after a couple hours, I came back and unclamped everything so I could remove any excess wood glue that I couldn't get while the clamps were still installed. And at that point, I could start removing the excess material from the shims I added, and I made sure I took my time with the removal of these pieces just so I don't accidentally take off too much or it snaps and takes off more than I wanted. So when I did this cut from one side only, it ended up coming off completely when I went past the halfway point. So just to be safe, I went halfway on the second piece. Then I took the blade out and cut the remaining from the other side just so I made sure I had a much cleaner and safer cut, which ended up working really well. When it came to installing the aprons to the leg assembly, I used these 90-degree corner clamps by Bessie to temporarily hold the back apron while I glued up the front apron, and this worked really well. But if I were to do this again, I wish I had used some extra 90-degree corner clamps on the inside corners where the apron and the middles of the stretchers meet, because later on when I tried to install this to the desktop, it took a little bit persuasion to get it to fit right. So if I could go back and do it again, I would have done that. I would have, instead of doing both aprons at the same time, I would have done one apron and then used the other corner clamps to hold the apron on the inside corners, and then repeat the same on the other apron. Before I did the final sanding, before I get to staining it, I filled in whatever gaps remained from the glue up and I just used a combination of glue and red oak sawdust, and it worked really well. Filled in most of the gaps pretty easily, and then after a few seconds I just sand it off and then add an extra layer if I need to. If not, then I could finally proceed with doing the final sanding. And as for the desktop, after cutting it to final length, I hand sanded the corners, and as for the edges, I used an 1/8 inch roundover bit on both top and bottom edges. To fasten the desk base to the desktop, I was initially going to use figure 8 washers, but then my buddy Trip Southern told me about counterboring, so after looking into it for a bit, I used a 3/8 inch diameter Forstner bit. I went 1/2 inch down into the bottom of the apron, then I went the rest of the way using a 1/4 inch drill bit, and then I used a 1.5 inch pocket screw to go the rest of the way. And this method essentially works the same as having a figure 8 washer, but probably better, and you still allow for wood movement. So when it came to installing the desk base to the desktop, it was a little tricky. Like I said earlier, I didn't use the 90-degree corner clamps on the inside, so it took a bit of persuasion and some clamping pressure to keep certain corners in place while I tried to install some screws. I even had to uninstall the first screw to install the third or the fourth screw, but it was a little bit of a hassle, but as long as you try to keep it square, you shouldn't have this problem like I did. So once the screws were installed, to uninstall and reinstall them wasn't hard. Afterwards, it's just figuring out where the holes should be placed was the difficult part. So taking it apart and putting it back together will be a lot easier now. Now that the desk base has been installed, now I can take it all apart and I can apply my golden oak stain and water-based poly, and I can be officially done with this build. So thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, please consider giving it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing if this is the type of content you like. And again, if you are interested in the design plans for this build, I'll leave my email in the description. You can shoot me an email, I'll send you a copy. So yeah, thanks again for watching and take care.